When we talk about, the rise and falls of currencies, kind of broadly, and I have mentioned SDRs and I mentioned gold. To me, it's a horse race. There are probably 5 or 10 entrants in the horse race, and I talk about all of them, but we'll see which one comes out on top at the end. But it's really important in this discussion to distinguish between a reserve currency and a payment currency. Now, the reserve currency is a big deal. And you say the U.S. dollar is 60% of global reserves, which it is, but it's not really dollars. It's not really the currency. The People's Bank of China does not have pallets of $100 bills, stacked up in their basement. What they have is a dollar-denominated security. So they have treasury bills and treasury notes, which are denominated and priced in dollars, and you need dollars to buy them. But it's not really the currency that's the reserve, it's the security that's the reserve. And what gives the U.S. dollar its strength in the form of U.S. Treasury securities primarily is the fact that you have a large, liquid, pretty good rule of law securities market that can absorb global savings. Now, if you don't have that, you can't be a reserve currency because there's nothing to invest in. It won't be the Chinese yuan, forget it. There's no Chinese bond market of any magnitude. There's no rule of law in China, and nobody would buy a Russian ruble bond. There's no good rule of law in Russia. And it's not just having bonds. Let's just say you started issuing bonds. Well, great. You need dealers. You need primary dealers. You need repo. You need futures. You need options, settlement, clearance, rule of law, hedging techniques. You need a whole infrastructure that takes, at least 10, maybe 20 years to build if you set out to build it. The U.S. Treasury market's been around since Alexander Hamilton. So we've had 230 years to get this right. So it's going to be very, very difficult to dislodge the dollar as the reserve currency. As a payment currency, that's completely different. When we were kids, we could use, baseball cards and bottle caps if we wanted to. And basically anything that I want to tender that you're willing to accept is a potential payment currency. Now here, there is a lot more ferment, if you will. The BRICS, that's, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but they now style themselves BRIC Plus. They are working on a new commodity-backed currency that they would use for trade between and among themselves. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia, China, and some of the Central Asian republics. But again, they're welcoming new members, including Pakistan and others. They're working on this. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union, which is kind of Putin's answer to the European Union. Same thing. They're working on a new payment currency. Comrade Xi Jinping from China is in Saudi Arabia as we speak, meeting with the Crown Prince and the King Salman, and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, to talk about, a lot of things, but included among them, would the Saudis be willing to sell oil for Chinese yuan? Again, I'm not saying it's a reserve currency. It's not. But as a payment currency or something you could swap in the markets for other kinds of currencies, yeah, that's entirely feasible. So that's going on around the world. And one of the things that's driving it, this was happening anyway, but one of the things that drove it was the U.S. sanctions and the EU sanctions on Russia, which are a complete blunder. The Russian ruble today is significantly stronger than it was at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Remember Biden running around, we're going to destroy the ruble. The ruble is stronger today than it was then. Russia has not lost oil sales. Whatever Western Europe doesn't want to buy, India's buying it, China's buying it. India never bought into the sanctions. They're friends with the United States. They're a democracy, but they're like, hey, this is not our fight, and we're going to buy all the oil from Russia that we can get. So it's had very little impact on Russia, some, but not a lot. It's been awful for Western Europe and the United States. Putin's strength is the military, the intelligence, the Orthodox Church, and everyday Russians. Those are the 4 pillars of his strength. But just look at energy prices in Europe. They're going to freeze in the dark this winter. It's already happening. The Germans are running around saying, we got our reserves up to 100%. And, natural gas reserves up to 100%. Well, that's true, but they don't tell you that the reserves are only 20% of the requirements. So as they have 100% of 20%, they don't have the rest. And it's not coming from anywhere, not anytime soon, not for years. And we all know what's going on with energy prices, home heating prices in the United States. This is feeding the inflation that's making people poorer. And there's more to it than that. But the point is, these sanctions have been a complete disaster and will remain so. And Biden said, we're not removing the sanctions until Russia leaves Ukraine. Well, I got news to the president. Russia's not leaving Ukraine. You could have had that deal before the war. There's never been a war that was easier to prevent. But the U.S. wanted the war. Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan and Susan Rice and all the other warmongers in the White House, they wanted the war. They got it. Now, good luck.
How do you see Russia adopting sound money in the near future, or do you agree that that's still what they're going after with those inflows?
Well, they did in advance. They anticipated this. Elvira Nabiullina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia, I discovered is the only central bank in the world who knows her job. She built Russian reserves. 20% of Russian reserves are in gold. Round numbers about 500 billion, a little more actually, about 600 billion of reserves, of which over 100 billion, about 120 billion are in gold. So they anticipated this. And going back to your earlier question, why are these other countries looking for ways out of the dollar? We put sanctions on the central bank of Russia. Now, I don't want to debate the war in Ukraine. I will, but that's a separate debate. But my point is, the world was shocked. It's like, hey, it's one thing to, sanction titanium exports or something. You froze the reserves of a central bank. So countries like Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, they're watching this and saying, hey, what if the U.S. doesn't like something we do? What if they don't like us next year and they freeze our reserves? We better get out from under the dollar before that happens. And one of the ways to do that is gold. I mean, buying German bonds doesn't put you much further ahead because Germany's kind of a vassal state of the United States when it comes to this until they break away. But gold does it. Gold isn't an alternative. Crypto's not going to come to much, but central bank digital currencies will. That's different. They're not cryptocurrencies. They're not recorded on a blockchain. The ledger is maintained by the central bank or the Treasury, Finance Ministry, as the case may be. They're definitely coming. They're already here in some places. Coming soon. The U.S., Biden has signed an executive order accelerating that path beyond the research, the R&D phase into a pilot program that will be coming very soon. And that is the last step in the totalitarian agenda, because they'll have to do two things at once. They'll have to bring in the CBDCs, but also eliminate cash. Because if you don't like central bank digital currencies, you'll just say, well, okay, I'll get a big pile of cash and pay cash and heck with that. So you got to get rid of cash also. But once you do, you're now in the total surveillance state. So right now, if I go into a bookstore and I buy a book like, I love Ron DeSantis, well, MasterCard may know, maybe not. They know I bought a book. But all of a sudden, the government and the FBI, the weaponized FBI and the new Gestapo, they're going to know that I bought a book in praise of one of the president's political enemies. And that makes me a political enemy. Or if I give a campaign contribution to a Republican politician and so forth. So they already know you're there. You've got your iPhone, unless you turn it off and stick it in a Faraday sack. They know you're there through GPS. They don't know exactly what you're doing. They could subpoena MasterCard, I guess. You need judicial help with that. But with the central bank digital currency, they would know. And then they can retaliate very simply with a couple of keystrokes, freeze your account, seize your account. Those kinds of seizures, freezes, withholdings, political surveillance, weaponized FBI, that will all come to a peak as a result of the central bank digital currency. That's the bad news. The good news is Americans, I would say people all over the world, are extremely adaptive and inventive when it comes to making new forms of money. When I was a kid, they're 10 years old, there'd be some uncle or somebody who would say, hey, kid, don't take any wooden nickels. And I was like, what's a wooden nickel? Well, it turns out during the Great Depression, there actually were wooden nickels. The Fed screwed up so badly there wasn't enough money. Communities would make their own money out of wood and paint a little logo on it, and merchants accepted it. It circulated. It was a way to expand the money supply. And they'll be able to do that. The recent ways to do it, by the way, was silver dollars, which is where the whole American currency system started. People will go to that once they realize, and they are realizing, that this is a tool of political surveillance and political enforcement by weaponized FBI. Maybe they'll have wooden nickels, but I think American silver dollars work just fine.